Clara Whitmore had spent her entire life inside a gilded cage, a place of such beauty and precision it became a prison without bars, confining her soul in silence. Born into one of England's most prestigious families, Clara was the only daughter of Victor Whitmore, a celebrated scholar and director of the National Institute of Culture, a man who prized family honor far above personal happiness. The grand estate where she was raised resembled a living museum. Long corridors lined with crimson carpets, golden chandeliers, and oil paintings of long-dead ancestors gave the house a haunting stillness. Books, thousands of them, lined every room, stacked from floor to ceiling like silent guards. Clara knew the names of every philosopher, every poet, every classical composer, but she had never tasted freedom. Her mornings began with a soft knock at her door by the housekeeper, followed by a carefully orchestrated routine: Oxford accent training, calligraphy practice, Latin literature studies, harp lessons, and scheduled meetings with her father's esteemed guests. Nothing was spontaneous. Nothing was hers. Her life had been scripted since birth, a rehearsed performance for a role she never asked to play. At 24, Clara had never been kissed, never been told she was beautiful without expectation, never argued back, not once. She dined in silence, moved in silence, and thought in silence. To the outside world, she was elegance embodied, refined, composed, and faultless. But inside, she was wilting under the weight of expectations no one could see. Loneliness was Clara's only companion. On quiet nights when the ancient house fell into stillness and the wind rustled through the ivy-clad walls, she would stand by her window, arms folded over her chest, wondering who she might have been if she were not Clara Whitmore. She had once imagined slipping into a crowded cafe, laughing too loud at something silly, or simply walking in the rain without an umbrella because a lady mustn't let her hair get wet no longer applied. But those dreams stayed locked in her mind, because to her father, and the society that orbited around them, Clara was not a person meant to be loved. She was a symbol, a polished pearl placed on a pedestal, to be admired, to be used, but never to live. And though she had never dared rebel, deep within her heart, there was a whisper, quiet but unshakable. I want to live, not to obey, not to please, not to perform, but to simply be myself. The atmosphere inside the Whitmore estate that afternoon felt heavy, so heavy it was as though the sky itself was preparing to break open. Doors shut harder than usual. The footsteps of the staff echoed faster, sharper. Clara sat in the reading room, a book open in her lap, but her eyes no longer followed the words. Something was shifting. She felt it like the chill that seeps beneath doorways before a storm. The door burst open, no knock, no warning. Victor Whitmore, her father, stood in the doorway. He looked gaunt, pale as if he'd aged 10 years overnight. Clara looked up, startled by the urgency in the man, who had always moved with measured grace and perfect control. "Father, what is it?" she asked, slowly setting the book aside. He didn't answer at first. He stood there, as if trying to gather the strength to say something even he couldn't believe. "You're getting married, Clara. This weekend." No preamble, no explanation. Just a single heavy sentence dropped into the room like a guillotine. Clara blinked, stunned. "What?" "We have no other choice," he said, his voice low, his eyes refusing to meet hers. In that instant, the world seemed to mute itself. The ticking clock faded. The wind outside vanished. Even her heartbeat fell silent. A vacuum opened inside her chest, swallowing every sound, every thought, every breath. "I don't understand. Married? To whom?" she managed, her voice shaking. This couldn't be real. She'd never even kissed someone, never been allowed to fall in love. But even so, she had believed, naively, that marriage would be her decision someday. Damien Blackwood. The name dropped like a curse. She knew that name. Everyone did. A tech magnate cloaked in power and mystery. A man who never appeared at galas, never smiled for the press, never wasted words. Yet he controlled everything. Newsrooms, boardrooms, politicians. He wasn't part of society. He was above it. She had seen his face once on the cover of a finance magazine. Those eyes so dark they seemed bottomless. A jaw carved in stone. No warmth, no softness. Not a man who bought affection, but silence. And now that man was to be her husband. Clara shot to her feet, stumbling back as though his name had pushed her to the edge of something she couldn't see. No, this can't be. I've never met him. How could you? Clara! Victor's voice cut through hers, soft but final. This time he met her eyes and she saw nothing but quiet surrender. I've lost everything. Our funding, our alliances, our name. Damien is the only way out. The way out? She whispered, her voice breaking. And I'm the price? He said nothing. There was no anger in his silence, no argument, only shame. And that, more than anything, shattered her. It was as if someone had stripped her bare in the dead of winter. The cold came not from the air, but from the truth. She was never a daughter to be cherished. She was a transaction waiting to happen, the last valuable piece left on the board. The wedding is this weekend, Victor repeated, as if speaking more to himself than to her. The arrangements are made. Clara said nothing. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. She didn't beg. She simply stood there motionless, as if she had turned to stone. And inside her, something broke. Not loudly but softly, like the final crack of a long-held illusion. From that moment on, Clara knew. She no longer belonged to herself. There were no flowers, no music, no smiles. Clara Whitmore's wedding felt more like a sentencing than a celebration. She wore a dress someone else had chosen, spoke vows she hadn't written, and signed her name on a marriage certificate that sealed her fate like a judge's final decree. There were no guests, only two men, one who had lost everything and one who possessed it all. Clara sat motionless in the back seat of the sleek black car, her hands clenched tight in her lap. The night outside blurred past the tinted windows. The vehicle drove her away from the home of her childhood, as though escorting her to her execution. When the car finally stopped, she lifted her eyes to see Damien Blackwood's estate, an imposing fortress of dark stone and glass, rising like a monolith in the woods. Cold, remote, unforgiving. The driver didn't speak. He simply opened the door and gestured. The massive front doors closed behind her with a thud that echoed like the ceiling of a tomb. No one welcomed her. No one congratulated her. Only silence, thick and stifling, followed her every step. A quiet housekeeper led her to the master bedroom, a vast chamber cloaked in shadow, where the bed stood tall and still, like an altar awaiting sacrifice. She turned to leave when the door behind her creaked open. Damien entered. He said nothing at first. Just removed his jacket, rolled up his sleeves, loosened his tie. His black eyes scanned her slowly, deliberately, as if taking inventory of every breath, every twitch of her fingers. Then his voice broke the silence, low, rough, and sharp as steel. "Did you really think you'd sleep alone tonight?" Clara instinctively stepped back, but her spine met the cold stone wall. Damien moved closer, unhurried, like a predator who never needed to chase. "You're my wife, Clara," he said, voice dropping lower, "and I always take what's mine." Her heartbeat thundered in her chest. There was no escape, no one to call, no place to hide. Every step he took brought with it a tide of dread. But what shocked Clara more than anything was herself. She didn't scream. She didn't strike him. She didn't push him away. Worse, when Damien touched her, her skin prickled. When his lips brushed her neck, her heart twisted, not just in fear, but in something far more dangerous. Something she didn't want to name. And when it was over, Clara lay still beneath the tangled sheets, the moonlight casting pale silver across her bare skin. Her body ached. Her mind raced. But what truly terrified her wasn't Damien. It was herself. Clara didn't know what to call the days that followed her wedding. Not quite a nightmare, but far from peace. Everything felt suspended, like she was trapped in a dream she hadn't consented to. A strange, quiet dream, laced with danger. Damien didn't lock her up. There were no rules, no chains, no locked doors or forbidden hallways. On paper, she was free. And yet, the feeling of being watched never left her skin. It wasn't invasive, but constant, like a presence that wrapped around her, whether she moved or stood still. What disturbed her most was the tenderness. The morning after the wedding, Clara awoke expecting cold sheets and emptiness, but instead a small breakfast tray sat near the window. A steaming cup of jasmine tea. Toast, cut just the way she liked. Fresh fruit peeled and sliced into delicate flower-like shapes. She stared at it for a long time, unsure whether it was real or a trap. Damien appeared at the doorway, silent. He looked at the tea in her hands and simply said, "I thought you might like it that way." She didn't answer, but something shifted, just a little deep inside. The next morning, it was there again, and the one after. Slowly, she realized Damien had noticed. He had been watching, not to control, but to learn. Her tastes, her rhythms, the quiet ways she lived. One afternoon, Clara sat reading in the garden as the wind picked up. Before she could stand, a heavy coat landed gently over her shoulders. Damien said nothing. He stood a moment, then turned away. She watched his retreating back, a strange warmth blooming in her chest. Sometimes when she sat too long at her desk, he would silently kneel before her, massaging her aching legs. No urgency, no expectations, just the quiet language of care. When she was tired, he let her rest. When she didn't want to speak, he didn't pry. But she knew. He always listened. The night she fell ill, her body fevered and mind fading, she felt the cool press of cloth on her skin. Damien's voice, hoarse and low, whispering beside her, "Don't be sick. Please, stay." When she opened her eyes in the morning, he was still there, slumped at the edge of the bed, his hand holding hers like it anchored him to the world. That moment stayed with her. She didn't understand why it mattered so much, but it did. She didn't know if it was love or some fragile, broken version of it. But she knew one thing for certain. She no longer feared him the way she once had. What frightened Clara most now was herself. Because sometimes when he entered the room, still stoic, still unreadable, she felt safer, as if his presence alone could keep her from unraveling. One night she woke to find him sitting beside her, gently running his fingers through her hair. There was no lust in the gesture, only something sacred, something delicate. She closed her eyes again, pretending to sleep. But her heart beat wildly beneath the silence. Clara had once believed Damien only knew how to take, but now when she looked into his eyes, she saw something else. A void, a fear, a man who had never been taught to love, but was trying. And that, more than anything, made her tremble. That morning, Clara woke with a strange weight in her chest. The sunlight outside was soft, her tea perfectly steeped, her breakfast tray beautifully arranged. Yet something inside her felt still, heavy. Damien entered the dining room moments later. This time, there was no silence. "He's trying to take you back," he said flatly. Clara looked up. "My father?" "Victor hired lawyers, a whole team. They're trying to annul the marriage contract. He thinks you're still his to command." Clara didn't flinch. "What are you planning to do?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. Damien's eyes locked onto hers. "Not let him touch you. Not with law, not with words." She exhaled slowly. "So, I need to be rescued again?" His gaze flickered. "I just don't want to lose you." "And what if I do?" Clara set her teacup down. "Has anyone asked me what I want?" The black car moved swiftly through the streets. Damien sat beside her, silent, but his hand rested on her leg, gripping softly, like she was something fragile and slipping. The glass building where Victor waited looked sharp, sterile, impersonal, much like the man himself. They entered the boardroom. Damien walked ahead like a shield. Victor rose when Clara entered but didn't step forward. He looked older, wearier, but his eyes still held that same familiar command. "Clara," he began, voice laced with false calm, "you don't have to live like this. You don't have to suffer." "Suffer?" Damien scoffed. "She's my wife. She's not imprisoned. She was bought," Victor snapped, turning toward him. "You used money to force my hand. Don't dress that up as love." "No one forced you to sign," Damien replied coolly. "I gave you a choice. You made her the bargaining chip. And you turned her into a prisoner." Victor's voice rose. "I won't let my daughter rot in some stone fortress, ruled by a manipulative tyrant." Damien leaned forward, voice low and sharp. "And what were you, Victor? A kind father? You locked her in a velvet cage for 24 years. No freedom, no air. You don't get to play savior now." "Enough," Clara said. Both men froze. She stood, steady and clear-eyed. "I'm not a thing," she said, looking at her father. "Not yours, and not anyone's." Victor stared at her, silent. Clara turned to Damien. "And you, holding on tighter doesn't mean I'll stay. I'm not something you can keep just because you're afraid of losing." Damien started to speak, but she raised her hand. "My whole life I've been silent, obedient. I did what everyone thought was best. I've never chosen anything for myself, but today, I choose." She stepped forward, standing between the two most powerful men in her life. "I'm not going back, and I'm not walking away out of fear. I'm leaving, because I need to learn to walk on my own." Silence filled the room. Victor lowered his eyes. Damien didn't move, but the pain in his gaze was unmistakable. For the first time, Clara wasn't someone being led. She was leading, and that was the one thing neither of them could ever control. Clara didn't wait for anyone to follow. She stepped outside, not in defiance, but in search of something deeper. Somewhere quiet, away from the walls where decisions were always made for her. She didn't know how far she had walked. All she knew was that her feet had taken her somewhere her heart had always whispered about. A field of wild daisies on the edge of the city, a place she had visited only once as a child. Back then she had thought, if there was ever a place I could belong, it would be here, a place where no one called her name, gave her orders, or looked at her like something precious and fragile. She stood in the middle of the white sea of petals, the wind tugging gently at her hair. The sky was bathed in warm golden light, and the fading sun scattered flecks of amber across her shoulders like falling stars. Clara closed her eyes and breathed deep. For the first time in what felt like forever, her chest didn't feel tight. And then she felt him. No footsteps, no voice. But she knew. Damien was there. She didn't turn around. "Why did you come here?" she asked, still facing the horizon. His voice came from behind, no longer hard, no longer controlled, but fragile, like a man unsure if he even belonged there. "Because you're not a contract," Damien said quietly. "You're the one thing I can't afford to lose." Clara let out a soft laugh, not mocking, but tired. A laugh that held both hope and heartbreak. "You don't have to say anything," she whispered. "If you came here to convince me to come back, I won't. I've made my choice, and I'll keep choosing. There was a long pause. Then she turned. Damien stood there, not the billionaire on magazine covers, not the man who could make the world bend to his will with a glance. Just a man, still, quiet and empty-eyed, unsure, unarmored. She saw the exhaustion in him, saw the cracks in the mask he'd always worn. And for the first time, she didn't feel fear. "Do you know what scared me the most?" she asked, stepping slowly toward him. "Not that first night, not your eyes, but what I started to feel and how I couldn't deny it." Damien didn't speak, but his shoulders trembled, just barely. "I don't know if it's love," she said softly, "but I know this. If you want to keep me, you can't do it the way you did before." The wind picked up. The daisies swayed in golden waves around them. Clara walked past him, her fingers brushing his shoulder. "Prove it," she said. "Not with words, not with power, but with how you choose to love me." And then she walked away, leaving Damien alone in the middle of the field, facing for the first time in his life the one thing he couldn't control. Clara returned on a quiet, rainy afternoon. No message, no warning, just her silhouette emerging through the mist. Damien stood frozen by the doorway when he saw her. He didn't run, he didn't reach. He just opened the door wide and stepped aside. Damien was there, waiting, but he didn't ask a question. He didn't reach for her. He only opened the door and let her in, as if he feared that touching her might make her vanish. She went upstairs, changed into dry clothes, and sat by the window. Damien never came up. Not that day, not the next three. They lived in silence. But it wasn't a silence filled with tension or resentment. It was space, a necessary breath between two people who had lived too long with noise, commands, and pressure. Clara watched. She noticed. Damien kept his distance, not out of indifference but out of respect. No looming presence, no ownership in his eyes, only quiet acts. Her tea appeared each morning, brewed just right. Her favorite reading chair in the garden was repositioned. A book she hadn't finished was left open to the exact page. No words, just care. And that was when Clara saw it. Damien wasn't trying to keep her. He was allowing her the space to stay or leave. And in doing so, she realized his love had changed. He was learning. And love that lets you go is the one that deserves to be chosen. On the fourth morning, the black cars returned. Victor hadn't come himself, but he sent a team of lawyers, documents in hand, legalities lined up to retrieve his daughter. Damien's face darkened when he saw them. He said nothing, but Clara saw his hands clench at his sides. "You don't have to do anything," he said, voice low. "I'll handle this." Clara shook her head slowly. "No, Damien, this one's mine." She walked outside to meet the men in suits. "Miss Whitmore," one of them began, "we're here on behalf of your father. All documents are prepared. The marriage can be annulled. If you agree, we'll proceed and return you to your former life." Clara took a breath. "My former life," she echoed, "where I smiled on command, followed every rule, and lived a life written by someone else?" No one answered. "I'm grateful for the education my father gave me," she said, "but he no longer gets to choose who I become." A man stepped forward, but she raised her hand. "I once believed Damien kept me here with power. I feared him. And yes, he was wrong. But these last 3 days, he didn't demand my return. He didn't beg. He just existed, quietly, respectfully." She turned slightly, catching sight of Damien in the doorway. He wasn't moving. He wasn't reaching out. He was just waiting. "And that told me everything," Clara said. "Real love doesn't hold you tight. It gives you the space to choose." She lifted her chin. "I am not being kept here. I stay because I want to." The lawyers had nothing more to say. Clara turned and climbed the steps. Damien remained still, almost afraid to believe. "Are you sure?" he asked softly. She smiled. "I came back days ago. You just didn't dare believe it." He looked at her, really looked, and the fear faded from his eyes. It was replaced by something quieter, purer, gratitude. He didn't move, but she did. She took his hand and kissed him, gently with intention. Not out of obligation, but because love, when freely chosen, is the only kind worth keeping. 3 years later, the daisy field bloomed as if time had never touched it. Endless waves of white petals swayed beneath the summer sky, their soft fragrance rising in the golden light. There was peace here, a silence that spoke of healing, of second chances. Clara stood at the edge of the field, her hand nestled inside Damien's. She was no longer the girl in a gilded cage. The light in her eyes was steady, calm, a woman who had walked through fire and found herself on the other side. Ahead, their twin children played, one chasing butterflies, the other occasionally glancing back to make sure their mother was still watching. Their laughter danced in the air like sunlight. Clara smiled, resting her head on Damien's shoulder. He gently squeezed her hand, like he still needed to remind himself that she had chosen him, that she was here. "Are you happy?" he asked, voice barely audible. She looked at him, not the man he used to be, but the man he had become. No control, no chains, only quiet love that asked for nothing, but gave everything. She nodded. "I've never felt more alive." That evening, a car pulled into the estate. No warning, no call. Victor Whitmore stepped out. Clara recognized him instantly. He was thinner, older, and quieter. His silver hair had spread, and the authority in his posture had softened into something more human, something almost vulnerable. He stood near the garden gate, not daring to come closer. Clara walked out to meet him. "I wouldn't blame you if you didn't want to see me," Victor began, voice unsteady. "I wouldn't blame you for anything." She said nothing. "I was wrong, so many times. I thought I was protecting you, but all I ever did was control. I turned love into a command. And I've spent the last 3 years wondering if I even deserve to be your father." Clara's eyes shimmered, but she didn't look away. Victor's voice broke. "But if there's any part of you, any small piece, that can forgive me..." She stepped forward and hugged him. Victor froze, then slowly, tremulously, embraced his daughter for the first time in years. His head dropped against her shoulder, his breath shaking. "You'll always be my father," Clara whispered. "Now, we just have to learn how to love each other better." From that day on, Victor returned, quietly, respectfully. He brought books for the children, told stories from the past, and most of all, he listened. Clara, once a girl held by rules, had become a woman who loved without fear, who forgave without losing herself. Damien, once a man used to control, had learned to wait, to soften, and to love without possession. They hadn't begun with love, but they chose to build it day by day with patience, humility, and humanity. And one evening, as the daisies swayed around them, Clara stood surrounded by those she loved, a husband who had transformed, children who laughed freely, and a father who had finally returned, not to command, but to be present. "Do you think we're a miracle?" Damien asked quietly. Clara smiled, squeezing his hand. "No," she said, "we're not a miracle." She looked out at the children playing, the sun setting beyond the field, and whispered, "We're what happens when love stops trying to own and starts trying to understand."